Sometimes a single slice of pie costs more than money. Sometimes it changes a life. The first cold wind of October drifted across the harbor town of Greyhaven, carrying the scent of salt water, chimney smoke, and freshly baked apples through the quiet streets. The sky hung low and silver above the rooftops as Caleb Mercer guided his aging pickup truck past rows of weathered storefronts. At 40 years old, the former Army engineer had learned how to survive on very little. The truck was his shelter now. The road was his address. Beside him sat Ranger, a 6-year-old German shepherd with alert amber eyes and a coat touched with silver along his back. The dog watched the town pass by with the calm focus of a partner who had shared every mile. Caleb checked the few dollars folded inside his wallet and managed a faint smile. It was enough for one meal. Nothing more. A warm glow appeared ahead through the gathering dusk. An old bakery stood at the corner, its windows golden against the gray afternoon. A wooden sign swayed gently above the door. As Caleb stepped onto the sidewalk, Ranger suddenly stopped. His ears lifted. His body became perfectly still. Then the dog turned his gaze toward the bakery entrance as though he had heard a voice hidden somewhere beyond the glass. Caleb followed his eyes, unaware that buying a single pie that evening would become the first step toward a miracle neither of them could have imagined. Caleb pushed open the bakery door, and a small brass bell chimed overhead with a soft, welcoming note. Warm air wrapped around him instantly, carrying the rich scent of cinnamon, butter, baked apples, and something deeper that reminded him of holidays he had not celebrated in years. For a moment he simply stood there, letting the warmth settle into his bones. Ranger stepped inside beside him, but did not relax. The German shepherd remained unusually alert, his ears tilted forward as his gaze swept slowly across the room. The bakery felt frozen in another era. Glass display cases gleamed beneath golden lights. Framed photographs covered the walls, showing smiling families, town festivals, and generations of customers holding fresh loaves of bread. Behind the counter stood an elderly woman arranging pies on a cooling rack. Her silver hair was pinned neatly beneath a blue scarf, and a flour-dusted apron hung loosely from her shoulders. She looked up as the bell settled into silence. Her blue eyes landed on Caleb first, then softened when she noticed Ranger. "Well now," she said with a gentle smile. "I was beginning to think nobody would come in before closing." Caleb returned a polite nod. "Just looking for something simple. Simple is what we do best around here." Her voice carried the warmth of someone who had spent a lifetime feeding people. Caleb approached the display case and studied the pies. Apple, cherry, pecan, blueberry. The choices felt almost overwhelming after months of gas station sandwiches and roadside meals. Finally, he pointed toward a small apple pie near the corner. "How much for that one?" The woman named a price that matched almost exactly what remained in his wallet. Caleb hesitated only briefly before pulling out the folded bills. The woman accepted them without counting. Instead, she wrapped the pie carefully in brown paper and tied it with a thin red string. "There you are." Caleb thanked her. Ranger suddenly shifted position. The dog's attention had locked onto something behind the counter. Not the woman, not the food, something farther back. His amber eyes narrowed. A low whine escaped his throat. Caleb followed the dog's gaze toward a narrow hallway leading deeper into the building. Nothing seemed unusual, just a closed door and a row of shelves stacked with baking supplies. "He is beautiful," the woman said quietly. "What is his name?" "Ranger." The woman's smile widened. "A good name." Ranger continued staring down the hallway. The woman noticed. For the briefest moment, something flickered across her face. Recognition. Surprise. Perhaps even concern. Then it disappeared. Outside, the harbor wind rattled softly against the windows. The bakery lights reflected in the glass like tiny lanterns floating against the approaching night. Caleb tucked the pie beneath his arm. "I should get going." The woman nodded, but her expression had become strangely thoughtful. As Caleb turned toward the door, she spoke again. "Young man." He stopped. "Yes, ma'am." Her eyes rested on him longer than seemed natural for a stranger. "If you are still in town tomorrow, come back." Caleb smiled politely. "I might." "Please do." Her voice had changed somehow. Softer, more serious, almost as though she were asking a favor. Caleb stepped outside with Ranger at his side. The evening air felt colder now. The harbor lights shimmered across the dark water. He walked toward his truck parked beneath a street lamp. unaware that behind him the elderly woman remained standing motionless at the bakery window, watching until he disappeared from sight. Nearly an hour later, after Caleb had settled inside the truck near the marina and shared pieces of pie with Ranger, the town had grown quiet. Fog drifted in from the harbor, swallowing the distant lights one by one. Ranger lay resting with his head on his paws. Then suddenly the dog lifted his head. His ears stood upright. His entire body became rigid. Caleb looked up from the old paperback book resting in his lap. "What is it, boy?" Ranger moved to the windshield and stared toward downtown. Seconds passed. Then, carried faintly through the fog and darkness, came the distant sound of a bell. One clear ring. Silence. Another ring. Silence. Then a third. Ranger stood perfectly still. The bakery's bell had just rung 3 times long after closing, and somehow Caleb knew the sound had been meant for someone. The fog lingered over Greyhaven through the night, like a pale blanket draped across the harbor. Caleb slept lightly in the cab of his truck, but Ranger did not. Several times before dawn, the German shepherd lifted his head toward the darkened town, listening with a focus that seemed almost human. By sunrise, a faint golden glow stretched across the water, turning the harbor into a sheet of rippling copper. Caleb rubbed the sleep from his eyes and watched fishing boats drift slowly from their docks. The memory of the 3 distant bell chimes remained with him. He could not explain why, but the sound felt less like coincidence and more like an invitation. After sharing breakfast with Ranger, he found himself driving back toward the bakery. The streets were beginning to wake. Shopkeepers swept sidewalks. Delivery trucks rumbled past old brick buildings. When Caleb turned the corner, he immediately noticed something unusual. The bakery lights were already on, yet the front door remained locked. Ranger stepped from the truck before Caleb could grab the leash. The dog walked directly to the bakery window and sat down facing the glass. His amber eyes never left the interior. Caleb approached and peered inside. Eleanor Whitmore stood alone near the counter. She looked smaller somehow than she had the day before. Sunlight spilled through the windows, illuminating tiny particles of flour drifting through the air like snowflakes. When she noticed Caleb outside, her face brightened. A few moments later, she unlocked the door. "I had a feeling you might come back," she said. Caleb smiled. "I had a feeling I should." Eleanor glanced toward Ranger. Looks like he felt it too. The dog entered immediately and headed toward the rear hallway again. This time he moved with purpose. His nails clicked softly across the wooden floor as he approached the closed door at the back of the bakery. Then he stopped and stared. Caleb noticed Eleanor watching the dog with growing curiosity. "He has been doing that since yesterday," Caleb said. "He usually does not focus on something unless there is a reason." Eleanor folded her hands together. "My husband used to say some animals listen to things people have forgotten how to hear." She led Caleb to a small table near the window and poured coffee into 2 ceramic mugs. The aroma filled the room. Outside, seagulls drifted above the harbor breeze. For a while they talked about ordinary things. The weather, the fishing season, the town. Yet beneath every conversation Caleb sensed something deeper. Eleanor seemed lonely in a way that went beyond living alone. She carried silence the way some people carried old photographs. Finally Caleb asked, "How long have you owned this place?" Eleanor's gaze wandered across the bakery walls. 53 years. Her voice softened. "My husband Samuel built most of it himself. Every shelf, every table, even that old brick oven." She pointed toward the back corner. "This bakery was his dream before it became mine." Ranger suddenly stood. His ears lifted. Slowly he crossed the room and sat beside the brick oven. Then he looked directly at Eleanor. The elderly woman froze. For several seconds nobody spoke. Something had changed in the room. Something invisible, yet impossible to ignore. Eleanor set down her coffee cup. Her hands trembled slightly. "That is strange," she whispered. "Very strange." Caleb followed her gaze. "What is?" Eleanor stared at the old oven, her eyes distant with memory. "That was Samuel's favorite place in the entire bakery. And your dog is sitting in the exact spot where he used to stand every morning before opening the doors." Ranger remained motionless. Then, from somewhere deep inside the building, a faint sound echoed through the silence. Not loud, not alarming, just a soft metallic click, as though an old lock had quietly turned after many years of waiting. The sound was gone almost as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind a silence that seemed heavier than before. Caleb looked toward the rear hallway. Ranger was already moving. The German Shepherd crossed the bakery floor with steady determination and stopped beside the old brick oven. His nose lifted toward the air. Then he pressed a paw gently against the wooden floorboards beside the oven's stone foundation. Once, twice. Caleb exchanged a glance with Eleanor. Neither spoke. The morning sunlight continued to spill through the windows, but somehow the room felt different now, as if an unseen page had quietly turned. Eleanor rose from her chair and walked toward the oven. Her movements were slow, thoughtful. Samuel spent years working around this oven, she said softly. Sometimes after closing, I would find him sitting here long after everyone else had gone home. She rested a hand against the warm brick. He always said every old building keeps secrets. You just have to wait until they are ready to be found. Ranger remained focused on the floor. Caleb crouched beside him and examined the weathered boards. At first nothing seemed unusual. Then he noticed faint scratches near the base of the oven, almost hidden beneath decades of wear. They were too straight to be accidental, too deliberate to ignore. He ran his fingers across the wood. Did Samuel ever repair this section? Eleanor leaned closer. Her eyes narrowed. Not that I remember. Caleb tapped lightly against the boards. Most answered with a solid sound. One did not. A hollow note echoed beneath it. Ranger immediately looked up. His tail gave a slow wag. The dog had heard it too. Outside, clouds drifted across the harbor sky. A beam of sunlight slipped through the bakery window and landed directly across the floorboards. Dust shimmered in the light like tiny floating stars. Caleb found a small tool in a nearby drawer and carefully worked along the edge of the loose board. The wood resisted at first. Then slowly it shifted. Eleanor held her breath. After several moments, the board lifted free. Beneath it was a narrow compartment hidden inside the floor. Time seemed to pause. Inside rested a small brass key wrapped in faded blue cloth. Beside it lay a folded envelope, yellowed with age. No one moved. Caleb carefully lifted both items into the light. The cloth felt old, but well preserved. The envelope bore elegant handwriting across the front. Eleanor gasped softly when she saw it. That is Samuel's writing. Her voice trembled. Caleb handed her the envelope. For several seconds, she simply stared at it. The bakery had grown so quiet that even the distant cries of seagulls seemed far away. Finally, she opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper. Her eyes moved slowly across the words. A tear formed before she reached the end. Caleb waited patiently. Ranger sat beside Eleanor, watching her with unusual gentleness. At last she lowered the letter. I cannot believe this. Caleb spoke quietly. What does it say? Eleanor looked toward the old oven, then toward the harbor beyond the windows. Her eyes carried the weight of 50 years. It says that if this letter is ever found, then the bakery is ready to reveal the next part of its story. She swallowed hard. And it says the brass key opened something hidden behind the wall in the upstairs apartment. The wind stirred outside. Somewhere above them, the building released a faint creak as if responding to words spoken long ago. Ranger suddenly lifted his ears and stared toward the staircase leading to the second floor. Then, without hesitation, he stood and began walking toward it. The staircase groaned softly beneath their footsteps as they climbed to the second floor. Ranger led the way without hesitation, his tail low, his ears forward, moving with the confidence of a guide following a trail only he could sense. Caleb stayed close behind, while Eleanor carried the letter carefully in both hands. The apartment above the bakery felt untouched by time. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns across worn wooden floors. Shelves lined the walls, crowded with old books, family photographs, and small keepsakes gathered over decades. A grandfather clock stood silent in one corner. The air carried the faint scent of vanilla, cedar, and memories. Eleanor paused near a framed photograph of Samuel. The picture showed a younger man smiling beside the bakery during its grand opening. He loved this place more than anything, she whispered. Sometimes I think he loved it almost as much as he loved me. Ranger continued forward until he reached the far wall of the living room. There he stopped. The dog stared at a section of paneling beside a built-in bookshelf. Then he sat down and waited. Caleb examined the wall. Nothing appeared unusual at first glance. Just old wood polished smooth by age. Yet when he looked closer, He noticed tiny marks near the edge of one panel, almost invisible, as though someone had opened it many years ago and carefully hidden every sign afterward. Eleanor's hands trembled as she passed him the brass key. Caleb searched the panel until he found a tiny keyhole concealed within the grain of the wood. The brass key slid inside perfectly. For a moment nobody moved. Then Caleb turned it. A soft click echoed through the apartment. Slowly the panel released. Hidden hinges swung outward, revealing a narrow compartment built inside the wall. Eleanor gasped. Inside rested several leather-bound journals, a wooden box, and a sealed envelope bearing her name. Tears immediately filled her eyes. Samuel. She reached forward carefully, as though touching something sacred. The journals were neatly arranged by year, spanning decades. The wooden box showed signs of age, but remained well preserved. Caleb lifted it gently and discovered another small note attached to the lid. The handwriting matched the letter from below. Eleanor opened the envelope addressed to her first. Silence settled across the room as she read. Outside, gulls drifted above the harbor. Somewhere below, the bakery bell chimed faintly as a customer entered. Life continued beyond the walls, yet inside the apartment time seemed suspended between past and present. When Eleanor finally looked up, tears rolled freely down her cheeks. He knew, she said softly. He knew he would leave before me. Caleb waited quietly. Eleanor smiled through her tears. This letter was written 23 years ago. She placed a hand over her heart. He wanted me to know that no matter how long I stayed here alone, I was never truly alone. Ranger moved closer and rested his head gently against her knee. Eleanor stroked the dog's fur with trembling fingers. Then Caleb opened the wooden box. Inside were dozens of old photographs, newspaper clippings, handwritten recipes, and a folded map of Greyhaven. Beneath everything else lay another envelope. Unlike the others, this one carried no name. Only 4 words written carefully across the front. For the one who finds this. Caleb stared at the message. A chill passed through him despite the warmth of the room. Eleanor looked equally surprised. Neither spoke for several seconds. Then Ranger suddenly lifted his head. His ears turned toward the window. Outside, clouds had begun gathering over the harbor once again. The afternoon light dimmed. A distant church bell rang across town. One time, then another, then a third. And for reasons none of them could explain, the envelope in Caleb's hands suddenly felt far more important than anything else they had found. Caleb held the envelope carefully as thunderclouds gathered beyond the harbor. The apartment seemed smaller now, as though the hidden compartment had opened more than a space inside a wall. It had opened. A doorway into a future none of them fully understood. Eleanor nodded toward the envelope. You should read it. Caleb hesitated. What if it was meant for someone else? A faint smile touched her face. Then Ranger would not have let us here. The German shepherd remained seated beside the window, watching the darkening sky. Caleb slowly broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. The paper had yellowed with age, but the handwriting remained steady and clear. The message was short. If you are reading this, then someone worthy has finally found what I could not leave in plain sight. The bakery was never meant to survive on recipes alone. Its greatest treasure is the people it shelters. Follow the map. Protect what remains. Trust the one who arrives when the bell rings 3 times. Caleb read the words twice. Then a third time. Eleanor stared at him. That sounds like Samuel. She glanced toward the folded map from the wooden box. Together they spread it across the old dining table. It showed Greyhaven decades earlier. Streets had different names. Buildings had vanished. Yet one location near the harbor had been marked with a small red circle. Beside it Samuel had written 2 words. Harbor House. Neither of them recognized the name. Before they could study it further, a sharp knock echoed from below. The sound startled them. Ranger stood immediately. His ears lifted. Another knock followed. Then another. Caleb looked through the apartment window toward the street below. A black luxury vehicle had stopped outside the bakery. 2 men in expensive coats stepped onto the sidewalk carrying folders beneath their arms. Eleanor's expression darkened. Not today. Caleb looked at her. Who are they? She sighed heavily. Developers. The word carried years of worry. They descended to the bakery together. The men were already waiting when Eleanor opened the door. Their smiles looked polished and practiced. One of them introduced himself and explained that a company from the city wanted to purchase several waterfront properties, including the bakery. They offered numbers that sounded impressive. Promises of progress. Promises of investment. Promises of change. Eleanor listened quietly. Then she shook her head. This bakery is not for sale. The men exchanged glances. One of them slid a document across the counter. You may wish to reconsider. Property taxes increase next quarter. Maintenance costs continue rising. It becomes difficult for older businesses to survive. The words were polite, but the meaning beneath them felt colder. After several more minutes they left, their vehicle disappearing into the afternoon mist. Silence returned. Eleanor stared out the window long after they were gone. They had been trying for years. Caleb folded the map carefully. Then maybe it is time someone helped you fight back. Eleanor looked at him with surprise. For the first time since they met, neither of them felt like strangers. Outside, rain began falling gently over Greyhaven. Tiny drops tapped against the bakery windows. Ranger walked to the door and sat beside it. Then the dog looked toward the harbor and released a soft whine. Caleb followed his gaze. Through the rain, far beyond the docks, he could just make out an old weathered building standing alone near the shoreline. Something about it felt familiar despite never having seen it before. The faded sign above its roof was barely visible through the storm, but one word could still be read. Harbor. Rain drifted across Greyhaven through the evening, turning the harbor lights into shimmering streaks of gold and silver. Caleb could not stop thinking about the weathered building standing alone near the shoreline. The map lay folded inside his jacket pocket, its edges worn from years of waiting. Ranger seemed equally restless. The dog paced near the bakery door, glancing repeatedly toward the waterfront as though an invisible thread pulled him there. The next morning arrived beneath a pale sky washed clean by the storm. Eleanor insisted they take a basket of fresh pastries before leaving. If Samuel left clues, she said softly, he probably expected someone stubborn enough to follow them. Caleb smiled. Then he chose the right person. Together he and Ranger followed the harbor road until the old structure came fully into view. Harbor House looked abandoned at first glance. Weathered shingles clung to the roof. Salt air had faded the paint decades ago. Tall grass swayed around the foundation. Yet something about the place felt alive. Not busy, not occupied, simply waiting. Ranger reached the front porch first. His ears lifted immediately. Then he trotted toward a side wall hidden beneath climbing ivy. Caleb followed. Behind the vines stood a small brass plaque nearly invisible beneath years of growth. He brushed away dirt and moss. The inscription made him freeze. Built in 1952 by Samuel Whitmore and Thomas Mercer. Caleb read it twice. Mercer. His own last name. A chill traveled through him. He had never heard the name Thomas Mercer before. Ranger released a low whine and nudged the door. Surprisingly, it opened. Inside, sunlight filtered through dusty windows. The room smelled of cedar, salt, and old paper. Furniture remained neatly arranged as though someone might return at any moment. On one wall hung dozens of black and white photographs. Caleb stepped closer. Men unloading fishing boats. Town celebrations. Families gathered around long tables. Then he noticed one photograph near the center. Two young men stood side by side in front of a newly opened bakery. One was unmistakably Samuel Whitmore. The other looked strikingly familiar. The same broad shoulders. The same jawline. The same eyes Caleb saw every morning in the mirror. Beneath the photograph, a handwritten caption read, Samuel Whitmore and Thomas Mercer. Partners. Friends. Brothers in all but blood. Caleb stared silently. His heart pounded. Ranger sat beside him, watching calmly. Beneath the photograph rested a small wooden cabinet. The brass key from the bakery fit the lock perfectly. Inside waited a leather journal. The first page carried Samuel's handwriting. If you have found this place, then you deserve to know the truth. Thomas Mercer saved my life during the hurricane of 1951. Without him, there would have been no bakery, no family, no future. We built this town together. We made a promise that if either family ever fell on hard times, the other would carry the light forward. Caleb slowly turned the pages. They described decades of friendship, sacrifice, and loyalty. Then he reached the final entry. His breath caught. Samuel had written it only weeks before his passing. The last line stood alone on the page. When the bell rings 3 times, the promise returns home. The drive back to Greyhaven felt strangely quiet. Caleb kept Samuel's journal on the seat beside him while Ranger rested with his head near the window, watching the shoreline pass beneath the fading afternoon light. The harbor shimmered beneath bands of gold and silver as clouds drifted slowly across the sky. For the first time in years, Caleb felt connected to something larger than his own survival. The name Thomas Mercer echoed through his thoughts. A man he had never known. A promise made decades before he was born. And somehow, through a chain of events too unlikely to ignore, that promise had found its way back to him. When they reached the bakery, they found Eleanor sitting alone by the window with a cup of tea cradled between her hands. She looked tired. Not weak, but weary in the way old trees looked after enduring many winters. Her eyes lifted as Caleb entered. Without speaking, he placed the journal gently on the table before her. Eleanor opened it and began reading. Minutes passed. Then tears slowly gathered in her eyes. "Samuel never told me everything," she whispered. "I knew Thomas mattered to him. I never knew how much." She turned another page and smiled through her tears. They built more than businesses together. They built each other's lives. The following week seemed to move both quickly and slowly at the same time. Caleb helped around the bakery every day. He repaired loose shelves, fixed leaking pipes, repainted old trim. Ranger greeted customers at the door, becoming something of a local celebrity. The bakery felt alive again. People stayed longer. They laughed more. Yet beneath the warmth, a quiet sadness lingered. Eleanor's health had begun to fade. Some afternoons, she sat for long stretches by the front window watching the harbor. Other days, she simply listened to the bell above the door ring as customers came and went. One evening, as the sun melted into the ocean beyond the docks, Eleanor asked Caleb to join her upstairs. The apartment glowed with amber light. Shadows stretched across the floorboards. Ranger settled beside her chair while she unfolded a document from a leather folder. "There is something I need you to know," she said softly. Caleb listened. Eleanor explained that after Samuel passed, she updated her estate, planned many times. Yet she never felt peace with any decision. Family members had moved away. Friends had grown older. Nobody seemed connected to the bakery the way Samuel had hoped. Then she smiled gently. Until recently, Caleb looked confused. Eleanor reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "You walked in with enough money for one pie and somehow reminded this building how to breathe again." Caleb lowered his eyes. He did not know what to say. Eleanor handed him the document. His heart began to race as he read the first page. It was a legal amendment prepared only days earlier. Signed. Witnessed. Official. The bakery. The apartment. The recipes. The business itself. Everything. Caleb looked up in disbelief. Eleanor's eyes shone with quiet certainty. Samuel trusted the promise. "I trust it too." At that exact moment, the bell downstairs rang softly. Once. Then again. Then a third time. Ranger lifted his head toward the ceiling. And for the first time since entering Greyhaven, Caleb felt as though he had finally arrived home. Autumn settled gently over Greyhaven in the months that followed. The harbor turned shades of gold beneath the morning sun, and the bakery windows glowed warmly against the cool coastal air. Life moved forward the way tides always do, quietly and steadily. Caleb still woke before dawn each morning. He still brewed coffee before opening the front door. And Ranger still took his position beside the entrance, greeting every customer as though it were his official duty. Some things had changed. Many things had not. The greatest change was the feeling that now lived inside the old building. It no longer felt lonely. Laughter filled the rooms again. Children pressed their noses against the display cases. Fishermen stopped in before heading to the docks. Travelers passing through town heard stories about the bakery and came to see it for themselves. On one wall, Caleb had framed the photograph of Samuel Whitmore and Thomas Mercer standing side by side all those years ago. Beneath it hung a simple plaque. Some promises take a lifetime to come home. The developers eventually stopped calling. The bakery remained exactly where it belonged. Harbor House was restored as well. Caleb spent weekends repairing the weathered structure, turning it into a small community gathering place where old photographs, journals, and local history could be preserved. People began donating family stories and memorabilia. What started as a forgotten building slowly became a living memory for the entire town. One crisp October evening, nearly a year after Caleb first arrived in Greyhaven, He locked the bakery doors after closing. The streets outside were quiet. A soft wind drifted in from the ocean carrying the scent of salt and pine. Upstairs, the apartment glowed with warm lamplight. It felt less like a place he stayed and more like a place he belonged. Caleb paused beside the front window and looked out toward the harbor. Ranger rested nearby, his silver-touched coat illuminated by the amber light. The dog appeared peaceful. Content. Home. Caleb smiled and scratched behind his ears. Looks like we made it, partner. Ranger responded with a slow wag of his tail. For a moment, silence settled over the bakery. Then the brass bell above the front door rang softly. Once, Caleb looked toward the entrance. No one stood outside. A few seconds later it rang again. Then a third time. The sound echoed gently through the building before fading into stillness. Caleb glanced toward Ranger. The dog had lifted his head, but he did not bark. He only watched the door with calm eyes, as though greeting an old friend. A faint smile touched Caleb's face. Outside, the harbor lights shimmered across the dark water. Somewhere beyond the town, waves rolled steadily against the shore. The wind moved through the streets like a quiet voice carrying memories from one generation to the next. Caleb never claimed to understand exactly how everything had happened. He only knew that one small decision had led him here. A bakery, a promise, a friendship that had survived decades, and a home he never expected to find. The lights remained on long after sunset, glowing warmly against the night, a reminder that kindness is never truly lost. Sometimes it simply waits for the right person to walk through the door.